Thank you, everybody. Let's stand. We will sing and make music. We will praise you, O Lord, among the nations. For great is your mercy, reaching to the heavens. Your faithfulness reaches to the skies. Be exalted, O God, above the heavens. Let your glory be over all the earth.
Stretched out, His love endures forever. For the life that's been reborn, His love endures forever. Sing praise, sing praise, sing praise, sing praise. Forever God is faithful, forever God is strong, forever God is with us, forever and ever, forever. From the rising to the setting sun, His love endures forever, and by the grace of God we will carry on. His love endures forever. Sing praise, sing praise, sing praise, sing praise.
Du Adonai ki tov, his love endures forever. Amen. Please be seated. Thank you, worship team. Rabbi Shaul, the Apostle Paul, wrote, "How then will they call on him in whom they have not believed? And how are they to believe in him of whom they have never heard? And how are they to hear without someone preaching? And how are they to preach unless they are sent? As it is written, how beautiful are the feet of those who preach the good news." And so this particular scripture is one of the foundational, motivational scriptures of Celebrate Messiah. And we see ourselves as called of God to share the good news with our Jewish people. The mission statement being, bring in the message to the original messengers. And we have been doing that since 1995. So we are in our 28th year as a ministry. And of course, these last few years have been certainly tumultuous in many ways. The building of the Caulfield Messianic Center in the midst of the COVID pandemic. But now that we have the center, we know that so much more needs to be done. And we are so privileged to be working together with Chosen People Global Ministries in 20 countries around the world now. The most recent country being Japan. Japan. So who wants to go to Japan and try the sushi and Jewish evangelism in Japan? Wherever Jewish people are, or wherever Jewish people go, and in case of Japan, many Jewish people go there as tourists or backpackers, and that's become one of our most important means of reaching out to our Jewish brethren, especially from Israel, our Israeli backpackers. And we'll share a little bit tonight about what we're doing here in Australia, but just to say that it's wonderful to welcome Japan to the Chosen People Global Ministries, together with 19 other countries, of which US is one of them. And we are very privileged to have Dr. Alan Shaw and Dr. Mitch Glazer with us from Chosen People Ministries in the US. Mitch shared with us this morning a very challenging, inspiring message about our Messianic heroes, the Hall of Messianic Heroes, the Hall of Fame. And again, in a moment, we'll invite Mitch to come up to share with us his second session. But we want to take up an offering right now for the work of Celebrate Messiah. This morning, we were privileged to take up an offering during the Beit HaMashiach service, which is for the Beit HaMashiach congregation, our normal congregational offering. For those especially who attend regularly Beit HaMashiach. But we're going to take up an offering now and again this evening for Celebrate Messiah. And this will be for the work of Celebrate Messiah. It'll be also to give appropriate honor and respect to our speakers and give them a love gift. But also we'd like to raise support for the rest of the work that we do throughout Australia and overseas as well. So we'll take up this offering in a moment. During the next song, you received a program, perhaps when you walked in. If you don't have one, raise up your hand, and the chairman of the board of Celebrate Messiah will serve you by handing out one of these programs. And what you'll see is a QR code on the top right-hand corner of this program. That's an easy way for you to scan it with your smartphone, unless you're Dr. Alan Shaw, who has a dumb phone. He told me he has a dumb phone, doesn't do anything except take calls. But if you have a smartphone, you can use the QR code to go up to the Celebrate Messiah website and make a donation. And we would appreciate that very much. All right, so now I'm going to invite you to stand once again, and we're going to worship the Lord with a song and then introduce Dr. Mitch Glazer once again. Thank you for your offering to Celebrate Messiah. Much appreciated.
The splendor of the King, clothed in majesty,
the Godhead three in one. Father, Spirit, Son, the Lion and the Lamb, the Lion and the Lamb. How great is our God! Sing with me, how great is our God! Oh, we'll see how great is our God.
Name above all names.
Name above all names, worthy of all praise. My heart will sing how great is our God. Name above all names, worthy of all praise. My heart will sing how great is our God.
Adore Elohai.
Gadol Elohai, Shiriki Gadol Elohai, Koyat Yireh, Ki Gadol Elohai. Gadol Elohai, Shiriki Gadol Elohai, Koyat Yireh, Ki Gadol Elohai. Shem Me'akol Shem, Ochara'ui le'aleh. Libi yashir ki gadol Elohai. Shem me'akol Shem, ochara'ui le'aleh. Libi yashir ki gadol Elohai.
How great is our God!
How great is our God! Sing with me, how great is our God! And all will see how great is our God.
Gadol.
Gadol Elohai, Shiriki Gadol Elohai, Koach Hayireh, Ki Gadol Elohai.
Lord, thank you very much. Worship team, thank you everyone. Please be seated. And so we have a second session today. And our speaker for this session is Dr. Mitch Glazer. And so we welcome him. For those who perhaps weren't here this morning, and I do see Calvin Crombie there. Hello, Calvin. Nice to see you. Welcome. As also one of our speakers in our third session. But if you weren't here earlier today, Dr. Mitch Glazer is the president of Chosen People Global, I'll say that again, Chosen People Ministries, US. He's the international coordinator for the Chosen People Global Ministries. He once was introduced as the president of God's chosen people. Now, that was a little bit ambitious. He's the president of Chosen People Global Ministries in the US, and we're very privileged to have him speak at our conference. So let's give him a warm welcome as he leads us in this session.
disappointing, Lawrence, to find out I'm not the president of God's chosen people. Are you suggesting that I'm not? Gosh, that'll be a cut in pay. And I get paid in so many different currencies. Actually, that did happen. It was kind of interesting. So it was at Billy Graham's last crusade, and it was in New York City. And so I was raised in what's the borough of Queens. Makes no sense to some of you, but I was raised in this borough, and the event was in Queens, and we were helping the Graham Association with different stuff, and so they said, why don't you pray before Billy preaches? Pretty much like the honor of my life, My mother didn't quite understand that, but it was really one of the honors of my life. And in getting introduced, Cliff Barrows, they were all getting a little older, honestly, and it should have been the last crusade. And so Cliff Barrows introduced me and said, and now praying for us is a son of Queens, a Jewish believer. It was Friday night on this Sabbath evening, the president of God's chosen people, Dr. Mitch Glazer. And it was a lovely moment. All I can tell you is I kept looking at my wife, and she was hysterical. And then the next day I went to our office in Manhattan, and everybody stood up when I walked in. I got the point. So I'm reading from Romans 11, verse 5. I've alluded to some of this before, but it's very important in light of where this, or at least the stuff that I'm talking about, is going to go. So in Romans 11, verse 5, the chief Messianic rabbi of the diaspora, the Apostle Paul, introduces us to a really interesting concept, which really flows, it's a major theme that flows throughout the Hebrew Scriptures. And that's the theme of the remnant. And so Paul is looking back at what happened with Elijah when he was fighting with Jezebel and losing, and headed into a cave to hide, and was despondent and said, I'm the only one who's faithful to God. And of course, he says, verse 3, they've killed your prophets, torn down your altars, I alone am left, and they're seeking my life. But what's the divine response to him? I've kept for myself 7,000 men who have not bowed the knee to Baal. And then in verse 5, the Apostle Paul does what every rabbi was trained to do, and what a lot of Christian preachers will do. They've learned how to take a narrative story in the Hebrew Scriptures and turn it into principles that we can live by. Very pleasant when people do that. So Paul does that, and it's a great time to say something like this. So Paul writes, in the same way, there's come to be at the present time a remnant according to God's gracious choice. And so in every day, in every age, from the days of Noah, where's Noah? From the days of Noah to the days of ancient Israel, to the times of Elijah, God always preserves a remnant among the Jewish people in particular to keep them and preserve them for his greater purposes. And God's covenants with Israel are indestructible. And so you notice in the Abrahamic covenant there's no time limits, there's no back and forth when it comes to you must do this and then I'll do that, like there is in the Mosaic covenant. And so it's a grace covenant. It is the covenant based upon which God will unfold the history of not only Israel, but to some degree the history of the world. Because there is always been a relationship between the Jews and the Gentiles. In fact, through you all the families of the earth shall be blessed. This is fundamental to the Abrahamic covenant. And so God chose the Jewish people for the benefit of the Gentiles. Of course, that brings a little bit of obligation on the part of the Gentiles on how they treat the Jews. And so bless those who bless thee, curse those who curse thee. And so in every age, God preserves a remnant, and it is by grace. God's riches at Christ's expense, forgive me, a little corny, but it works. It's unmerited favor. And God made the covenant. Does Israel deserve the land? No. Israel doesn't deserve the land. The land was given to Israel as a gift. And the deed was signed in Genesis 15 by the blood of split animals. And God never rescinds a grace covenant. And so there's a remnant according to God's gracious choice, which means you can't go wrong in reaching Jewish people with the gospel. You will actually always be successful. It won't always feel that way, but you will always be successful because God's preserved a remnant. And as Lawrence mentioned in Romans chapter 10, how can they hear without a preacher? How can they hear unless they've been sent? All those who call upon the name of the Lord will be saved. So there's certain things that man does have to do. But God will help us do it. Now, that leads us to the end of Romans chapter 11. So at the end of Romans chapter 11, beginning at verse 25, for I don't want you, brethren and sisters, to be uninformed of this mystery, so that you will not be wise in your own estimation. A partial hardening has happened to Israel. Partial hardening. Well, if there wasn't partial, I wouldn't be here. Alan wouldn't be here. Lawrence wouldn't be here. So it's a partial hardening. And Paul goes on, has happened to Israel until the fullness of the Gentiles has come in. So the partial hardening is temporary. The fullness is the destiny of the Jewish people. I also like this part, which a lot of people skip over quickly. You know, it's always good to read the Bible slow. So a partial hardening has happened to Israel until the fullness of the Gentiles has come in. Boy, I tell you, I don't think there's a passage in the Bible that motivates me more to tell Gentiles about Jesus than that passage. Gentile missions, Gentile evangelism is on the clock. We always think we have all the time in the world. We don't have all the time in the world. And it's not simply that Jesus is coming back. It's that God's plans and purposes are scheduled. We don't know the schedule, but they are scheduled. And those schedules are unbreakable. And so the means by which we get there is not going to change. So God will once again work powerfully and primarily with the Jewish people after the day when the fullness of the Gentiles has come in. Okay? And so the person, and really help me out here because, and I'll give you my email if you need it, but the person I'm looking for the most is the last Gentile. So if you happen to know anything about where that person is, because, you know, once that last person gets in, you know, things get really rolling for the Jewish people. And, you know, we've had a long road. So I'd like to get this done with. And so, until the fullness of the Gentiles, and so all Israel will be saved. I've been in a lot of theological symposiums and different kinds of things like that. And I always get a kick out of some of the topics. And so the one topic, I did a really high level one, and I was definitely the least educated person in the room, but it was a pretty high level one. And the question was, what did Paul mean by all Israel will be saved, and when will it happen? Who's supposed to know that? So this is where you really play theological ping pong, you know? And I listened to everybody's opinions, and I said, it was my turn. I said, well, I think it's going to be all Israel. Why is that? Well, it says all Israel. And when will it happen? Well, when the fullness of the Gentiles comes in. And when will that be? I don't know. But we have a great commission, and we don't want Jewish evangelism to be the great omission, do we, of the commission? And so we have a great commission to go into all the world, all the nations, to make disciples. Why? Because we're going somewhere. We're not just flapping about. God has a direction for humanity, and we're headed in that direction. The plan is set. We don't know everything about it, but what we do know about it, we need to be obedient and do our part, right? Okay. So I thought maybe we should look at this remnant more carefully. Because the remnant is interesting. Who are the remnant? How many are there? Where are they? How long have they been there? So I think studying who Messianic Jewish people are is an interesting study. And it's a very biblical study because we know that there is a remnant in every day and every age. But we don't define it. So I thought maybe we put some definition to it. You with me on that one? Don't expect everything to be clear-cut, okay? So we want to ask the question, how many Jewish believers in Yeshua are there? And what can we learn about the history of this? So I get to change this myself. It worked. Look at that. So we do look back to look forward. There was a, Kelvin, was he Dutch or French? Deleroy. Dutch, wasn't he? Yeah. So the Dutch get all the, I don't know, between Nettie and Kelvin and Paul, I think we're being overrun by the Dutch today. But so, well, you guys did some good work during the Holocaust, so I appreciate it, And so Deleroy was a student of Jewish missions, and he wrote a book that is actually not easy to get, but it is quoted in English by a book that was written in 1901 by a Christian Missionary Alliance, missionary to the Jewish people, who worked in Jerusalem. And if you want, you can go to Jerusalem and go visit him at his grave. It's there. And his name was A.E. Thompson. Okay, so that's probably not on your latest tour of Israel. And so Thompson quoted Deleroy and said there were 72,740 who went into evangelical churches, 57.3, Roman Catholics, 74.5, Greek Orthodox, total of 204,540 Jewish people came to faith during the 19th century. Now you might say, how could you possibly know that? I mean, how could you count? Well, one of the reasons you can probably know more then than you know now is because in those days, mostly in Europe and wherever the Greek church, which was the Orthodox church, which would have been everywhere from Turkey to Greece, makes sense. If you change religions during the Middle Ages on up until way after the Enlightenment, particularly in Europe, you had to re-register if you got baptized. So it's a real issue about Jewish people becoming believers in Yeshua, and some didn't want to get baptized because they didn't want to re-register and say, I'm no longer a Jew. And so it was a big deal. But in some of these groups, like the Roman Catholic Church and Greek Church, in a sense, you couldn't really be looked at as a believer unless you got baptized and became part of the church, because that was part of church membership. Now, I do think people should get immersed, and I do. It's in the Bible. But I understand some of those who didn't want to. There was a very famous group later on of what they called Jewish believing Jews. And they were in Hungary, and they didn't want to get baptized. And there were plenty of them, but they didn't want to get baptized because if they got baptized, they'd have to re-register in Hungary, which probably meant you could re-register as Reformed, but you might have to re-register as Catholic, depends on what it was. And so in the entirety of the 19th century, do I think the 204,540 is correct? Well, I don't know, but it's not a bad number, probably. And because people went in and counted the baptisms. And so today, how many of you Jewish believers have re-registered after your baptism? Just what I thought. As we move on, Leon Levison, who is the president of the International Hebrew Christian Alliance, which is now the International Messianic Jewish Alliance. Leveson was speaking about the first third of the 20th century, and he said that 97,000 Jewish people in Hungary had become believers in Yeshua. Now, is that an accurate number? Funny thing about that is, I think with Leveson it was an anecdotal number, but there was a book called Apostasy in the Modern Age, and there's a chapter on this Hungarian movement in what is a strictly mainstream Jewish history book, and they use the same number, basically. And they counted baptisms. So I don't know if Leveson counted baptisms. But it was the common sometimes just because it's anecdotal doesn't mean it's not right. You just have to be cautious. 17,000 in Vienna, should have been all of Austria probably. 35,000 in Poland, 60,000 in Bolshevik Russia, don't you love that? And 20,000 in the US. So Leveson put this out in a lot of different publications, and this quote's from the Missionary Review of the World, 1931. And so, is this an accurate number as well? Well, I think it might be. Might be. It was quoted all over the place. And so, but these anecdotal quotes can start with one person and everybody else just does it. But I think it could have, the Hungarian part's accurate. And based upon my research of that period, I can easily see that this might be accurate. Because I didn't count baptisms, but I read every annual, mid-annual, I read reports from a half a dozen of the largest Jewish missions all the way from 1900 through the 1950s. I read them all. And I think that this is probably fairly accurate. So in the first third of the 20th century, we can say that there were between 250,000 and 300,000 Jewish believers. But there may have been more, and this, of course, is a little controversial, because some of them, I don't think Leveson was counting Catholics or Orthodox. And I know in my research, I couldn't count Catholics or Orthodox, or I'd still be doing my doctoral dissertation. So I felt Kelvin would do that when he retired. And so these might be true, but the numbers might be as many or more if you count the Catholics and the Orthodox, because where did the Jewish people live during the 20th century? They lived in Poland. Think there were any Catholics in Poland? They lived in Europe, right? They lived all over the Middle East. Any Orthodox churches there, you think? Oh, wait a minute. Were there Jews in Russia, you think? Come on, you've seen Fiddler on the Roof. Or Ukraine. What about Ukrainian Orthodox? Most of the Jewish people lived in areas that were dominated by Catholic and Orthodox churches. To say that none of them joined those churches is ludicrous. To say that they were all in doctrinal error. I'm going to leave that to Lawrence. He's preaching on that next week, on the doctrinal error of the Catholic and Orthodox churches. You don't want to miss this. So all I can tell you is God has his standards, I have mine, and all I know is you need to believe in Yeshua, his death for our sin and resurrection from the dead, and you can be saved. So whatever comes on top of that disqualifies you is definitely above my pay grade. So, more than 200,000 in the 19th century, 250 to 300,000 in the first third of the 20th century. First third. Okay? So in Europe, only an estimated 3.6 million remain of the total Jewish pre-war population of 7.5. And so there was quite a drop in all of this. I just keep this in mind as we move forward. There's a lot of implications to this. Question then is, should the Messianic Jewish population have be reduced by 1/3. In other words, but we don't know, but probably not. In the post-war period, there's just a lot of information about Jewish believers who came to the Lord during the Holocaust. And so let me read one of these for you because it's fascinating. And that is by Victor Buxbazen, who is a Polish Jewish man who lived in Krakow and worked for the British Jew Society, which is a historic Jewish mission that started in the 1840s. And anybody here ever been to Krakow? Yeah. Anybody here eat goose in Krakow? Allegedly, the Jewish people like goose. Did you have goose when we were there? Oh yeah, I had goose. I've been there a few times, but there's some old synagogues there. It's a beautiful little section of Krakow. And the funny thing is that I think the modern Polish folks are trying to demonstrate that they're sorry about the Holocaust and they want to affirm Jewish culture, which I think is sincere. And so you have about 15 to 20 restaurants in this area. Kazimierz, yeah, that's it. And so all of these restaurants have evening klezmer shows. And so you can go there and dance the hora and hear great clarinet playing and so on. It's an interesting thing. But Buxbazen escaped just by a hair and went to England before he came to the United States. But he writes this about the post-war period. And again, I'm looking at the post-war period to tell me about the war period. Okay? In post-war Holland, I visited a Hebrew Christian, Messianic Jewish, if you don't like that, brother who told me how the Lord had wonderfully preserved many Jewish believers through the kindness and friendship of the Dutch people. And if you want to learn more about that, Kelvin has written an entire book on Jewish believers during the Holocaust in Holland. So the Dutch people took a Christian stand against Hitler, protecting their Jewish compatriots at the risk of their own life. And many Dutch people paid the price for it. Hebrew Christians were rounded up by the Nazis and imprisoned in concentration camps together with other Jews. But there they were tested to their Lord and testified for him as long as life lasted. Those are the words of Buxbazen. So there's another person who is a Dutch missionary to the Jewish people, Grohl, who said spies were active, but also were the illegal resistance organizations. Some hidden Jews were caught and together with their Christian hiders, deported. Christian love for Israel was shown. Many a Jewish heart was moved by this. They were blessed experiences when the Lord opened these Jewish hearts. Many were converted, and in this way, not only the body, but above all, the soul was saved by the grace of God. Some hundreds of them who were hidden in Christian families gave their hearts to the Lord. Isn't that neat? And so, again, we can't be cynical of anecdotal reporting. You'll see, I like surveys. We're going to get to it in just a little bit. But I do think anecdotal reporting these are great testimonies. So let me now just give you just a touch of an overview of how I see this all shaking out historically. So this is my very, very well done and creative chart. Okay? So we don't know how many Jewish believers there were necessarily before World War I because we have Thompson's numbers, but Thompson's numbers was for the whole century. So we don't know. So I started at a little over 100,000. But then something happened. And I have a lot of reasons that I can suggest, but there was an outpouring of the Holy Spirit in between the wars in Europe. It's almost as if God knew what was going to happen. And so if you read the reports of the various ministries among the Jewish people, you can see what was happening. I mean, there was, in 1 year, I think it was 27 or 28, the Jewish missionaries in Romania charted about 800,000 or 900,000 800 or 900 Jewish people coming to faith that year. When's the last time you saw 800 or 900 Jewish people coming to faith? You know, I remember reading those numbers and saying, oh, that's good. And I said, what was that? I've been doing this work since I'm 19 years old. I've never seen 800 or 900. I've seen multiple thousands sort of in the Jesus movement and then in the Russian movement, as you'll see. But 800 or 900,000 in one country like that? I mean, it's just astounding. And then it happened year after year. And sometimes it was more. What was happening in Romania was happening in Poland, was happening in Hungary, was happening all throughout Europe. And so, where the Jewish people lived. So, I say, I follow the numbers that Levison suggested. So I say that there were over 300,000 Jewish people who had become believers in Europe immediately before World War II and the Holocaust. Then we have the Holocaust. And what happened during the Holocaust? Well, during the Holocaust, most of the Jewish people in Poland, which had 3 million Jewish people, were killed. And so I happen to know that chosen people had a property and at least one Messianic congregation in Warsaw before the Nazis marched in 1939. But so did many other Jewish ministries. Remember, we're 128 years old, and I'm not the founder, you know that, okay? However, Alan Shore is the founder. And I will prove it probably tomorrow or the next day. I will prove it tonight. Thank you. So the Holocaust killed our leaders. The Holocaust destroyed our properties. The Holocaust destroyed all of our youth activities, of which there were many. The Holocaust decimated the Messianic Jewish movement because the Messianic movement was centered and focused where the majority of Jewish people lived, and that would have been Eastern Europe, and to some degree Central Europe, and that would have been all the places where the Nazis were killing Jews. So among the 6 million Jewish people who were slaughtered by the Nazis, how many Jewish believers were among them? Well, we don't know, but I would suggest hundreds of thousands. And so after the Holocaust, we had to begin the Messianic movement again. So this is Messianic movement like 3.0, maybe 4.0. We lost our people. And, I mean, it's beyond horrible, but I don't want to go there for a moment. It's good to do history. I can be a little clinical. But just so you know, I'm not the son of Holocaust survivors, but between my two grandparents, they probably had 15 or 20 of their kids killed, along with my grandparents' parents killed, along with all the cousins, uncles, and aunts that were related to me that I would never meet, and the same on my wife's side. And so it's still an emotional issue for me. So we were decimated, and then God loves to raise the dead. You know that? And so God began to raise the dead. And I don't know if you're going to see the movie here in Australia, but there's a wonderful little movie that just came out called The Jesus Revolution. And if you haven't seen it, it's pretty good. It takes place mostly in Southern California. I was in Northern California, so I don't know as much about what happened in Southern California. But whatever was happening there was definitely happening where I was. And so it was an outpouring of the Holy Spirit. And among those who were being moved to faith in Yeshua was a remnant of Jewish people all across the United States and in Australia and in South Africa and in Israel and in every country across the globe eventually was touched by this movement. And so God began reviving the dead, and the Messianic movement began growing again. The Jesus movement, quote unquote, where hippies like me got saved. I know I still look like a hippie, and I'd grow my hair if I could, you know. But the Jesus movement was a significant work of God. And I always talk about, when people ask me, were you there in the Jesus movement? I always say, yeah, I was in the Jewish wing. And it was a tremendous movement. And then you would think that it would have stopped, but if you think about it, aside from Israel and the United States and some other places, where were the majority of Jewish people still living? Well, you're right, in Russia, Ukraine, and the former Soviet Union, the FSU. And what happened? Perestroika. What happened with Perestroika? You can date it at 1999 or 2000 or 2001. But what happened? What happened is that probably about 1.4 million Jewish people moved to Israel. Probably about 800,000 moved to the United States. Probably 30, 40,000 to Australia, maybe. That many? 20, 30? Yeah. Another 40, 50, maybe to Canada. And then probably 200,000 or 300,000 to Germany. And the Lord just swept through. Look, one of the things you have to understand is immigrants are oftentimes open to the message of the gospel because they're no longer rooted. They're open to new things, open to new values. If you see a bunch of immigrants, go start witnessing fast, okay? Because it doesn't take long for them to adjust and the window closes. And so a lot of these guys, I remember seriously handing out tracts in Brooklyn, and these people came up to me and said, oh, that's very interesting, in very, very broken English. That's very interesting. So I'm learning a lot about Judaism now. I said, yes. And she says, so you're saying there's Reform, Conservative, Orthodox, and you. So these poor Russian Jewish immigrants were now including us in the mainstream Jewish community, and they didn't know. And I said, well, yeah, sort of, yeah. And they were so open to the Lord at that time that I felt it was my moral duty to tell them that they needed to think twice about it. And they said, no, we want this, you know. And there were days when I remember, there was a day we were teaching English as a second language to Russian Jewish people in Brooklyn, of which there were many Russian Jewish people. And in the ESL classes, instead of a final exam, we would give invitations to receive the Lord. And I got a call from one of our workers who was leading that, who was a very close friend of Rita's, Claudia Shalesny. And Claudia called me up and said, Mitch, what do we do? I said, what happened? She said, 75 Russian Jewish people just accepted Jesus. I said, you didn't think about that ahead of time? And so, you know, it was just marvelous. So it was sort of like ready, shoot, aim, because Jewish people come to faith in the Messiah. And then we are here today. So let's try and figure out how many we have. Now, I have done research on America. I would like to have done research on Australia, but I am not here to do the research, but I'm definitely here to encourage the research. Lawrence is now saying, why didn't I invite him? I love him, but why did I invite him? You know? And so, a few years ago, Chosen People Ministries wanted to know what born-again believers who we're calling evangelicals for the moment, we wanted to know what they thought about Jewish people. And so we went with the Southern Baptists, and we did 2002 surveys, and we're very confident that what we have here is very accurate. If you don't know about how to do surveys, it's okay, most people don't, but it's quite accurate. To have 2,000 people fill out an internet survey with 100 questions, they've got to be serious. Now, they were not just any people. You might say, well, how do you know they were evangelicals? How do you know they were born again? Well, because we asked them a lot of questions, and if they missed any of these, then we screened them by phone. We started with a random sampling, screened them by phone, and then we sent them the internet survey. It's pretty elaborate. I won't tell you how much it cost. So we asked these questions. The Bible is the highest authority for what we believe. It's important for me personally to encourage non-Christians to trust Jesus as their Savior. Jesus' death on the cross is the only sacrifice that could remove the penalty of my sin. Only those who trust in Jesus alone as their Savior receive God's free gift of eternal salvation. So we didn't say, are you an evangelical? We asked them all these questions. If they got one wrong, they were out. And so do I think that they were all real believers? Well, close. Nothing's perfect. So this is some of the results of the surveys, and then I'm going to get to a very important point of the survey. So we found out that 71% strongly agree that sharing the gospel with Jewish people is important. That's good news, right? Yeah, it's great. Then we found out that 35% of those with Jewish friends have prayed for the salvation of their Jewish friend in the last week. So numbers went down. Then we found out that 60% had not shared the gospel with any of their Jewish friends in the last year. So the results were getting, not so good. But we wanted to know where people were at. We also found out a ton of information. I'll give you one little piece. I don't think I did it here. But one question was, do you believe that the modern state of Israel is the fulfillment of prophecy? And that number was almost 80%. So I know you sometimes think that the whole church is becoming replacement theology, right? But no, that's not true. It's not true. I'm not saying some aren't. They are. But some people always have been, Here's the one that really got us. This one was, we had no idea we were going to even ask this question until the last minute when Joel Rosenberg, have you read some of his stuff? So Joel was involved in this, and Joel was a political pollster, so he liked asking a lot of random questions. And so he said we should do ethnic questions, what's your background, and where you're from, and what language do you speak, and we also asked how much money do you earn, So we found out a lot of demographic information, like in most surveys. And Joel said, hey, we left out the Jewish. We should just ask if you're Jewish. So then we debated how we should phrase it. So we used the Aliyah definition: one or more grandparent, one or more parents, one of your parents Jewish. And we didn't even we had no idea that what we were going to find out was what we were going to find out. we did it. Sometimes Joel's persuasive. We just do what he says. And so what we found out is that 2% of those who espouse evangelical theological and doctrinal viewpoints have either a Jewish parent or two or a grandparent or two. It's not a bad definition of who is Jewish. It's not the one you would probably use. You would probably want to use they're Jewish, one of their parents might be Jewish, especially their mother, but they should be active in Jewish life, they should celebrate Passover, some people, but those are different, that's different kind of information. But 2% of the people thought enough about their identity and their heritage to answer the question, which to me means something. And so the question is, how many was 2%? So we went back to our research analysts and we said, this number is really small, does it mean anything? And they went back and looked at it and said, well, yes. On a projected basis, and I'll show you how the projection was made. On a projected basis, this would mean that there are 870,771 adult Americans, who we only did adults, who have evangelical beliefs and have one or more Jewish parents or one or more Jewish grandparents. The usual number we had been using was 1% or 0.5%. Now, the funny thing about a survey, because I'm one of the people that say these things, and that is, you can't reject the survey, a well-done survey's results just because it doesn't agree with you. You've got to at least listen to it. And so this took, you can only imagine, we were gobsmacked. So 2% of evangelicals with 102 grandparents who are Jewish, by projection, of course, by projection, is 877, 71. But when you take a different tact and look at the numbers of Jewish people, it's not 2% are evangelicals. It would be, you could say it this way, 11% of Jews by ethnicity have evangelical beliefs. 11%. So that's huge. And of course, I felt that once we did these numbers, I said, that can't be right. So we kept pursuing it. And we basically used the number of 40 million evangelicals in the United States, 7.8 million U.S. Jewish adults by ethnicity and religion, which is the expanded definition by the Pew Foundation, if you know who they are. So this is really significant information. These are the pros who are telling us this. So the American Jewish Yearbook says that there are 6.85 million Jewish people, but in the last Pew survey in 2017, they plucked out about 1.5 million Jewish people who were raised in a non-Jewish home, including a Christian home. So any Jewish person that was raised in a Christian home, Messianic or not, because it doesn't matter, Pew would have said, well, we can't consider them Jewish, so we're going to give them their own chapter in our survey. So we then survey them as an entity rather than including them within the Jewish community. We complained to Pew. They didn't listen. So what we did is, we at least in the numbers of Jewish people, we included them as Jews. So if what the Jewish community is saying, or Pew is saying, in limiting Jewishness to not, if you were raised as quote unquote a believer in Jesus, or a Christian home, which could be anything, but if you were, wow, that means you're not Jewish. So my wife and I are Jewish. I have 2 daughters. It meant that Pew decided that my kids were not Jewish. I don't think they really can do that. And the Hirsch kids, no way, they're not Jewish. Lawrence is Jewish. I know he is, okay? Louise is actually more Jewish than Lawrence, but it's actually a whole different issue. There's counseling for that. So the figure 11% of American Jews have evangelical beliefs was astounding to us. Astounding. That doesn't mean that they all celebrate Hanukkah, but the Jewish people with 2 parents who were raised in a Jewish home doesn't mean they celebrate Hanukkah, but it's one of the ones they might. So I brought this over to Australia. So how many evangelicals are there in Australia? Now, I have asked experts for the last couple of days, and nobody knows. I'm sure somebody knows. And if you know, don't call it out, but tell me later. So I had to develop my own projections. So I went to some really good sources. I know they're good because they're on the internet. So I went to some pretty good sources, like the last 2016 census done by the Australian government, which asked questions on religion, which they do not do in the United States because we're not allowed. But you are allowed in Australia. You would think the privacy rules are much stricter in Australia than they are in the United States. But they asked the Jewish question. I was a bit shocked. So I did find out that the largest groups of Christians in Australia are Anglicans and Catholics, and that represents 78% of those who identify as Christians. I also found out that almost 10 million, did I lose you? That almost 10 million, I was right. Thank you. Whoever did that is right. That almost 10 million Australians said they had no religion. So this is the growing group of nuns. Not N-U-N-S, N-O-N-E-S. This is the growing group of nuns. Now, last time I checked, Australia had, 25 million people? 50% of your country? Wow, that's a lot. That's a lot. Wow, you're almost as bad as New York. So I found out more from the Australian Bureau of Statistics. Christian affiliation in 2016 was 12.2 million. The recent survey was 2021. And in 2021, 11.1 million, a drop of almost 10% in 5 years. That's a lot. And the largest drop, no surprise, was between those who were between 18 and 25. But the greatest increase amongst those who mostly identified as Christians were classified as NFD, not further defined. Boy, that could go a lot of different ways. But those were the Christians who basically did not identify with the denomination, and that number increased by 75,000. I'm an American, so I have to use what I know. So that would include Hillsong, that would include your Bible churches, probably include some others, Yes, exactly. Yeah. Now, and that's why I would think that number probably gets us on the way to find out how many real born-again believers or evangelicals are in Australia. So I believe that number is probably helpful. Now, since I pulled up my wrong survey, I'm going to read this one. So, number of believers with Jewish ethnicity. Well, I found out that Jewish people are increasing by 9.8% in Australia between 2016 and 2021, by almost 10%. So I got to tell you, usually Jews don't have a lot of kids, but So it's possible that 14% of the Jewish population, of the evangelical population have Jewish heritage. 14%. Well, I use the 700,000, or sometimes in playing with it over the last few days, I bumped it up to 1 million. You got to assume some of the Anglicans are believers, of course. I know, you're Anglican. And so I'm a friend of Mark Leach. I know that there's at least one Anglican Jew, I know. So, but this really needs to be done by professional survey people, but I thought I'd take a stab at it. So now when I say, and you can't really quote me on this because we don't know how many evangelicals there are, so we can't determine it. We know how many Jewish people there are. But if it was based upon the 2% in the United States, then there would be 14,000. Now what that means doesn't mean that you have all these Jewish people in the church who are celebrating Hanukkah or even Passover. But it does speak to the ethnic question. Because in a lot of areas, particularly particularly Jewish people, Australian and American Jews and British Jews and South African Jews, we're all a lot alike. A lot alike. Not exactly, but a lot alike. So now we did some comparative studies in the U.S. and found out that in the Pew surveys, 1.6 million people were raised in homes that are ethnically Jewish but religiously Christian. That was 21%. Mind-boggling. Mind-boggling. Now, that doesn't mean that they were all evangelical. They could be any type of Christian, but that's a big number. And Pew decided that they thought it was mostly authentic Christianity. We studied, there was a Jewish millennial study done by Jews for Jesus through Barna. And according to the Barna report in 2016, millennials represent 20% of the adult Jewish community in the U.S., almost 1.6 million, and 21% of millennials believe Jesus is the Son of God, approximately 300,000 Jewish people. What do they mean by that? The survey didn't ask. That's the problem with surveys. You get whatever you put in, But again, that's that 21% number. Now look a little bit at this chart, and I find this to be very interesting. And that is, in 19th century Europe, based upon our numbers and the fact that there were 9 million Jewish people at that time, the percentage of Jews who believe in Jesus was 2%, based on the numbers we had. The number of Jewish people in the pre-Holocaust period, again, you had 9.5 million Jews, and the number of 300,000 was about 3%. See some patterns? Might be more serious and true than we think. But then the 21st century in the U.S., you have number of Jewish people, 7.8 million, 11%, almost 900,000. Now, could be the definition. Maybe if we took a broader definition of being Jewish in the pre-Holocaust period or the 19th century, we would have had more. Okay? So you have 11% evangelicals with Jewish ethnicity. The traditional figure was less than 78,000, although I think it's a stronger Jewish identity. It's almost 900,000 people. So it's also possible that a large majority were raised with the knowledge of their Jewish ethnicity, but identify as Christians. So, wrap it up. I think we need a new perspective on all of this in trying to understand the remnant. We must recognize that we are reaching a new type of Jewish family, impacted by intermarriage, with a new perspective on Jewish identification. I had to think to myself, why would these changes be? Certainly when I became a believer, who ever even heard of a Jewish person who believed in Jesus? So whatever the number is, it's more. So this should be especially understood as we lead and plant Messianic congregations. So the future of Messianic congregations will be in the hands of Jewish believers who probably are not as traditional. I have found, believe it or not, that Beit HaMashiach has a few more traditional Jewish people than the average Messianic congregation in the United States. That is anecdotal. Also a new perspective. Faith in Yeshua the Messiah is not viewed as harshly as in previous generation. 34% in the Pew study, 34% say belief in Yeshua is not incompatible with being Jewish. You want to sleep on that one? Is that unbelievable? 34%. See, what I'm trying to say is as we did further research and crunched more numbers, it started to seem that some of what we were coming up with might be true, but it just goes against what we assumed. Since the majority of ethnic Jewish believers in Jesus are in evangelical churches, we must, and I mean Jewish missions and Messianic congregations, must find ways to include them in the Messianic movement that go beyond our regular programming and efforts to include them in our congregations and ministries. Because some of them are happy with their churches. Oops. We're going to leave the 5 questions for later. We must understand our responsibility to Jewish believers and their families who are satisfied with the local church, but as we are compelled by scriptures, believe they should become more connected to their Jewish heritage and part of an identifiable remnant. And so one of our ministries, I think one of your ministries, one of Celebrate Messiah's ministries, and I think it's a very important ministry, knowing that there are so many Jewish believers with some type of Jewish ethnicity in the U.S. church and probably in the Australian churches, then it behooves us to reach out to them so that we can strengthen their Jewish identity for their own souls, but also strengthen their Jewish identities so that through them we can help them reach their families. So I think there are a lot of implications to all of this. And so we'll consider some more later on. But I think we were due for a break, though somebody I know started almost a half hour late. So let's go. I'm done.
Okay, I said you're going to learn a lot from this conference, perhaps stretching our understanding of who we are a little bit more than, just seeing ourselves as this little group here in Caulfield South in Melbourne. So we see we're part of a worldwide movement, but we also can see that God has been doing this before. We're not something new, really. God has been working amongst the Jewish people right from the beginning. There's always been a remnant. And that remnant grew before the war and got knocked out for the most part, and then was reborn again sometime in the 60s, I say, late 50s and early 60s. So the 67 with the unification of Jerusalem in 67 and the Jesus movement. I'm too young to have been part of the Jesus movement, of course, so we came a little bit later in that graph that Mitch had, and when he saw that the Russian Jewish movement, that's when Celebrate Messiah and Chosen People Ministries joined together, really, in the year 2000. So lots of very interesting data as well as to who's out there. One of the key ministries that is strategically put onto our vision in the next few weeks and months, in fact, is to relaunch a ministry to intermarrieds. That is the group that Mitch was really talking about, Jewish people who might be in an intermarried situation, Jew and Gentile, or their children. That's going to be one of our key target groups in the next few months and in the next year or two. That's one of the key strategies that we have. It's very important, and even if we look at our leadership at Celebrate Messiah and Beit HaMashiach, most of us are in mixed marriage families. So, obviously we should be reaching out to that group, and you probably know many of them as well. Some of you are them. All right, so we're going to have a break now, but I'm not going to let you have a too long a break, all right, because we still have quite a bit of sessions ahead. We have another main session, which is quite much longer than this first session. So we're going to have a break. Now it's 10 to 3. We were going to come back at 3, but not to worry about that. Come back at 3:15. 3:15, okay? And then we'll start the next session and be ready for the next session. It's something you have to prepare your heart for as well, and be ready to hear and to see where we are as a movement. Thank you very much. Okay, 3:15.